Is the mic on? Good. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last session of the day. How many of you still awake? All the brain cells still working? And still good? Wow, I see 2 thumbs up. That's great. So my session is about TelePresence. Myself, I live in Singapore. I cover the whole Asia-Pacific, Japan, China. I used to be in TelePresence business unit. That's why they asked me to fly over here to cover this session. I'm on my way out, 9 p.m. flight out, back to Singapore, and then I'm back to Tokyo for another presentation on Friday. So this session really, has any of you went to yesterday's TelePresence workshop, the 8 hours? One of you, 2? How many? Okay. So this session is going to be really a very shallow, not going to be as deep as that one, but probably going to be regroup some of the information you already know, try to put into a more marketing and sales and architecture point of view instead of in depth in terms of which element is going to do what. The second thing I'm trying to do is to connect the CUCM to VCS. I think along the past few years, of course, there were a lot of questions. Even today, yesterday, Peter Moody was telling me there were questions about VCS versus CUCM even today. I just want, again, reassure you guys how our long-term strategy is going to go. Within this session, it's going to touch on the core control, the media service. We're going to touch on endpoint a little bit and scheduling as well. I would like to keep this session interactive. Please shoot any questions to me. If I can't answer, I will make sure that I get your name card and we'll get back to you later on. So we start with a very high-level marketing term in terms of what we think where our long-term strategy is. This is set after Rowan became our senior VP for CTG since about 9 months ago. And he has made some changes. Before that, you're probably seeing any device and connect from anywhere. I think he made one key difference is the last part, is in a delightful way. What happened is that a lot of technology works today. We know that. The fact is, engineers in the lab, we all make things work. But however, from a user standpoint, they may not see that way. They see a lot of disconnected technology. They see, for example, if you dial from video to UC, you have to use different domain, vcs.somedomain.com versus a uc.domain.com versus IPT. They're disjoint technology from user standpoint. They're actually using different sets of sort of capability instead of using a comprehensive collaboration capability. What Rowan came on board and he said, we need to change that. And we have enough technology in the infrastructure. We don't need to make more things, but we need to make things work more smoothly. I think that's the key difference what I picked from him. Everything's enjoined. Another thing he said was mobile and cloud first. I think in the keynote, if you watch the Enterprise Connect VOD, it's already available on the internet. If you have a watch of that, it's very clear. He said, the mobility and cloud is the way moving forward for us. I will explain a little bit on that later on, what we mean by that. In terms of what Cisco stands, so I think 2 more slides on marketing stuff, and then we'll dive into detail in the technology and architecture. Number 1 is most of the enterprise is actually buying more enterprise video today. If you go out there, talk to most of the CIOs, they want to transform the way they work. And who has heard about the Google's Chromebox? The one they came to market, $1,500, right? Who's thinking, wow, that's revolutionary? Really, it's not, right? Actually, if you look at the endpoint price, the endpoint price dropping line, cutting towards the line, actually, we saw this 3 years ago. Around 1,000, 1,005, I see it's the tipping point. The reason for that is very simple. If you go out to Harvey Norman anywhere, you buy a HD, a TV. So currently price maybe around 1,000 Aussie dollars, right? If you do a DIY solution, you're plugging a camera and plugging a remote control and plugging a codec. What happens is that you have yourself sort of TelePresence there, okay? And that altogether, it becomes a sort of 2,000, 2,500 endpoint out there. It's not that much different to what a Chromebox can do today. On the other hand, Chromebox, for example, doesn't have a very high HD camera. So what we try to do is to package things right. That's why if you see the latest announcement, if you've seen in our demo area, we have SX10. So I think that will be the killer product for a do-it-yourself room-based system. Okay. Then if you look at the cloud video, so Blue Jeans, so I think Blue Jeans in Australia already, we see this market is truly on the rise. The reason for that is just the cost base. So what they've done is say if you deploy an MCU in the cloud, somehow you can reduce the cost of the MCU. The reality is we got a lot of the US federal actually tried out Blue Jeans. Last 2 weeks ago, I was in US and talking to our federal team in US. What they've done is, what they found out is it's good enough experience. What happens once the MCU is in the cloud, you don't have QoS from the enterprise to the cloud. It's still running the best effort internet. If you connect all these guys together, all of a sudden it becomes the best effort, right? So who's going to pay for the best effort? Not many people. And they're not going to pay a lot as well. So what we try to do is do the cloud fusion way. That means our MCU may be on your premise or in the controlled environment with QoS. Then our control signaling or the way you redirect the traffic is going to be in the cloud. So if you do it that way, you have best of both worlds, the scalability of the cloud as well as the QoS and control of the media mixing on premise. So that's what we try to do. I think it's a bit different approach to pure cloud guys like Blue Jeans and so on. In terms of our success in video, the last marketing slide, 42 million users with video turned on. So if you really think about what Blue Jeans is capable of, this is really a WebEx best effort video. So that we say we already have 42 million users out there using our technology today. 1 billion revenue. On top of that, 10 million Jabber already turned on with video capability and 12% year-over-year growth for the endpoints. So these, I think, a lot of success with Cisco video out there. And I think, of course, with a partner and customer support like yourself. In terms of what we want to do, so we mentioned before it's going to be in a delightful way and any device, any connection. We try to do, number one, is as easy as voice. Voice has a unique feature. I'll show you in terms of dial plan how we're going to design this in the future, is that voice has a unique feature. That means I can call anyone, anywhere in the world. There's a global ITU-based plus dial plan that I can follow. I don't really need to know which network you are. The second part is that if you're using a DNS-based routing mechanism, we had email, the send mail since 70s. And we can send email from one company to another company as long as I can do a lookup on the domain address. So in terms of the business to business, really we have two ways to solve the problem, right? So one is the URI way, one is E164 way. We want to make sure that our video and voice will work consistently across these two different ways. The second part is from any pane of glasses, from my iPhone, sitting there being charged, iPad, and all the way to large devices. You see the MX700, MX800, as well as TX9000, triple screen, dual screen, single screen systems. The last part is better being there. Have you all looked at the speaker tracker demonstration in our demo area? If you haven't, I really recommend you go there tomorrow. The idea is this. If I'm standing here talking to you, I think the last person sitting in the back, although my LASIK eye surgery tells me I should have 20/20, but I can barely see you smiling at the back. The reality is if I have a speaker tracker camera, I will be able to zoom in and then see actually his face much better than if I'm standing here without the zoom in my eye, obviously. Another thing is the overlay information. Okay. What we found is, for example, if you put content on top of overlay to the human being, for example, the speaker name, who they are, and what information they're sharing, what department they're from, and it's who are other people supporting that organization as they overlay information. That almost makes being there is not as good as being virtually there. I think that part of the key thing. We're working on this, and I think within 6 to 9 months, you will see something revolutionary from there as well. This is where we are in today. Essentially 4 different layers. We'll go through one by one. I will start with the core control first. Then we'll go through the media service, scheduling, and at the end is endpoint. Okay, so let's start with a high-level walkthrough of what we're trying to talk about. We'll talk about this session really about enterprise design with the TelePresence video across the whole enterprise. So we're looking at high-level design, low-level design. But where do we start? We always start with the call control. Call control is really to route a call from one side to another, to have call admission control, E164 as well as URI dialing. How do we enable that? Most of the company today, if you came from H223 video world, you still will have some H223 endpoints out there. Then how are you going to integrate these two things together, right? And once you get that sorted out, the end result is any of the endpoint on the CUCM can call any of the endpoint on VCS, as well as you achieve a unified dial plan. I will show you a bit later. This thought process is quite different to before. I will show you what's before and what's after, compare what's the 10.0 version will allow you to do. So the dial plan, we sorted out. A routing feature, we sorted out. The third part is the media service. In the past, we will have to have the MCU as a media service, for example, on the VCS as well as the CUCM, because the triggering mechanism to use this media resource is quite different. Okay, I will show you later on how in the 10.0 release we achieved a consistent sort of triggering mechanism across the board, so we only need to have resource under the CUCM control. We no longer need to have that parked under VCS control. And then the scheduling part. I think we still have a little bit gap on the scheduling. In the 4.0 release of the solution release, we should have all that sorted out. Currently, we'll have some gap in terms of TMS scheduling the conductor. I'll show you the detail a bit later on. But this problem is well known and we're sorted out. We're going to sort this out very quickly. The finally is the edge. Who actually went to the edge design session? Well, some people did, right? I think that's, again, it's a part of the game that in the future, when you talk about cloud fusion, that becomes more and more important in the future. Currently, what it can do is, of course, the bridging the Jabber, bridging all the video endpoint, DX70 and 80, if you've gone to the NDA room, that's the next generation endpoint. When you connect from outside of your company to the inside of your enterprise, that's the technology you will have to use. Okay. So let's talk about the call control portion. You all should have seen this slide before. I'm not going to talk through this. VCS world, CUCM world, that's been like that ever since we bought a company, the Tamberg. What I want to show you is today. Okay. So what we've done from 9.1.2 release, pretty much is a stable release. I'm confident that's going to work that way, all the way to 10. So we do have 2 iterations of the releases already. So a few key things I want to pay attention to. One is all these endpoints released today. Sorry to put an E20 there, but that should be actually a DX80. I was told not to put a picture there, so I put a replacement of the E20 there. All these endpoints will be registered to CUCM. Okay. When you connect out to the internet using sort of domain lookup or remote worker, we're using the Expressway C and Expressway E. And don't get confused with VCS Expressway. Okay? These are the same product, but they are taking 2 different trains. Well, if you really think about it, VCS will continue to be a VCS. They can register endpoint, but Expressway will never register an endpoint. Fundamentally, that's the difference. Okay? Expressway always going to be sitting on the edge, becomes an edge device. They are not going to be a call control device. Right? They are not going to be a line-side device. So this is going to be our Expressway. Of course, we simplify this, E on this side and C on this side. Okay? So that's for B2B, mobile, remote work, etc., going from outside in and inside out. The second part is the conductor. Conductor actually is derived from VCS. If you ever installed a conductor before, who's installed a conductor before? Very good, very good. Much better than I thought. The conductor actually is a VCS with CPL running behind. Okay, so if you log on, you'll see the sort of remnants of VCS and still lingering around. What that does is to put a bunch of MCU and TelePresence together. Okay, that's what it does. What we're going to move on to the future is that becomes a mandatory component. Mandatory component. If you look at a new VTS, Virtual Telepresence Server, running on the UCS server, so that has to have the conductor. The C series and the 5300, you have to have the conductor. So therefore, it becomes a mandatory component. I will show you a bit later on. Yes, go ahead.
How do you schedule a conference like resources?
Very good question. That's the gap I was talking about before in terms of TMS scheduling via the conductor. That's a feature coming up around mid-year. So currently, so I prepared the Go Lab during the SCVT. You probably get your hands on it within a month's time. That particular Go Lab, we're using the 2.3 release of the conductor, and we're using the 3.0 or 3.1 release of the VTS. With that one, you can schedule it, but there's no confirmation of the resource. So currently, what the real gap is that the conductor doesn't guarantee the future resource in the conductor sort of database. It doesn't know the future. So that's what we try to put in the next release of the conductor. Once you have that, yes, you definitely can guarantee the resource. Today you can still schedule it, but it just doesn't guarantee the resource.
At the moment, if I schedule, say, 20 meetings at 10 a.m., those 20 meetings can go on MCU and they're not being enough resources or that.
That's correct. So what you really want is that you can lock down the 20 MCU and whatever meeting number ports you want, and all the ad hoc ones will never eat into that, right? So that capability is not there yet, and it's going to be available in mid-year. Yeah, so the question is regarding, if I rephrase this, is how oversized subscription is going to work on the conductor, right? So what we found is this. If you have a scheduled meeting, normally we don't want to do any oversubscription at all, because we will assume that all the endpoints are going to dial in, and if it's an important meeting, you don't want anyone to oversubscribe per se. But for ad hoc, we do oversubscribe a lot. So I will show you later on how do we derive some of the formulas in terms of how many ports you're going to do for the ad hoc meetings. But what ideally is supposed to happen is you have a pool of resources in terms of ports. You have the scheduled one guarantee the number of ports going to be allocated for the scheduled ones. And then you have the ad hoc pool, which is based on calculation and how you estimate the user's behavior, and then you sort of assign that many ports for that. And if the scheduled one have already started, it's not using it, for example, someone didn't turn up, and then this can sort of eat into the already scheduled and abandoned ports. That's the idea. Okay? And we know what to build, but it takes time to reach that particular sort of maturity for the resource control. And the final part is the gatekeeper and registration part. So in that case, we still have to use the VCS. Remember I mentioned to you before, the expressway can never be a core control device. So if you think about that, then you say, well, what do I do with the H223 endpoint if I want to do the interworking? And then you have to go with a VCS solution. But if you see the investment we're going through, and most of them is going to go through, of course, the expressway for the fusion and then the B2B functionality, instead of course, investing on the gatekeeper functionality, which is 80s technology at best. Okay, so all that from 10.0, that's what we propose as a preferred architecture. You should go forward with this. This slide actually came from last year's session, and what I did was to grade out the things features we made up from last year to this year. For example, last year we couldn't do encryption for the video on CUCM. We can do that today. Last year we couldn't do the firewall traversal because we couldn't do the expressway, and now we have expressway, so therefore this is grayed out. If you have a look, the leftover bits, we never really intend to, or apart from the IPv6, for the rest of the bits, we never really intend for CUCM to have. So therefore, the message to you is there's not much work left for CUCM to do to be a replacement of the VCS. Okay, so if I express myself clearly, really it's about for new greenfield, you should always go for the CUCM. You should not go for the VCS anymore. If you have VCS already deployed, you should figure out a way to migrate to CUCM, because all these cool endpoints you see in the NDA room, they're not going to work with VCS. Okay? So things like the DX won't work with VCS at all. So you better have the CUCM ready once all these endpoints can be orderable. I think May, June time in Australia, you better have all that ready. The Jabber video, again, Mobi is going to be replaced by Jabber. It's very clear. And then IPv6 is a roadmap item. Any questions on this? Okay. Terminology, I'll skip that. You already know. So what we try to do then is, this again, it's a very old slide. Ever since, I think, the VCS 5 days, you can do a SIP trunk between CUCM and VCS. And really is a SIP trunk between them, and you can route through that. But back then, remember, CUCM was very weak on the SIP. Okay? I will show you a bit later the important improvement we've done in the 10.0 release, why this interworking becomes much easier now. Two things to really highlight here. One is what we call the top-level domain. In the CUCM 9.1, I think, from 9.1, there is a service field you can configure to say what's the top domain name, let's say cisco.com. When the CUCM sends the SIP call out, instead of using its own fully qualified domain name or the IP address, it will use that. Because ideally, I can have a host name of cucm.cisco.com or cucm1.cisco.com, but really what I want to send out is cisco.com, correct? If I'm a user, have both sort of a video endpoint as well as IP phone as well as Jabber, I don't want people to remember, oh, if I want to call video, call VCS, bill at vcs.something.com. If it's calling an IP phone, becomes UC and something.com. Doesn't make any sense. We want to call bill at cisco.com, correct? So therefore, what we've done is once you have the top-level domain name, we'll overwrite all these SIP messaging going out with that domain name. So the return will just really return to the whole infrastructure instead of returns going to that particular CUCM. Again, this lab, once you get your hands on the Go lab, please try that out. That's one of the key things that we did that lab for. The second part is the 80-bit authentication. So instead of 32, now we support 80-bit. That was particularly important for the Korean market because the military there wants to use 80-bit. So, again, when you connect the CUCM to VCS, you use a SIP trunk. You have two ways to do this. You can nail it, or you can use a SRV record lookup to send to it. For the reverse, you can either use DNS lookup versus a nail it back in as a neighboring zone. I will compare the pros and cons later on. So here's option one. So let's use the SRV record. This is for the CUCM sent to the VCS. So what's the pros and cons of this? If you're using the SRV record, there's only one SRV record per domain. Okay? So if you're, for example, using a top domain, cisco.com or anyone.com, you can only have one SRV record, right? But the reality is, if I want to achieve a consistent dial plan, URI dial plan, not E164 dial plan. E164 is easy. If I want to achieve a consistent URI dial plan, I don't want to know that the endpoint's on the VCS side or the endpoint on the CUCM side. I don't want to know that. Because if I know that, then that means you have to know the subdomain, correct? So I don't want to know the subdomain. I want to know the top domain only. So therefore, the SRV record becomes tricky if you want to achieve, just do it that way. It becomes a flat domain name. Because you run out of, you really need two sets of SRV record, one for the VCS and one for the CUCM, right? So currently, our recommendation is you want to do a flat dial plan for UI, go for the nailed version, because the SIP retry and all that will be able to handle the redundant sort of high availability SIP trunks fairly easily. So you don't actually need to rely on the SRV record to do the round robin at all. And vice versa as well. I'll show you. So this is how the whole thing's going to do a lookup, etc. I will skip that. It's not that important. So this is our recommended method to do this at the moment. So what we do is from CUCM, we do multiple SIP trunks to the VCS cluster. And you can have priority, but in the same group, route list group. And you can give sort of different priority to different group. That means always go to the first one first, and second one, and third one, etc. And or you can put the same one, so therefore it will do the round robin. It's also okay. What happens is that you can have the SIP keep alive, and if this VCS is down, the keep alive will go down, so therefore it will never try this because the keep alive is down. Or if you send a call to this VCS, after 3 seconds there's no reply, you can, the system will automatically try the second one. You'll have a longer post-out delay, but at least you have high availability. If you have a SRV record, it's almost the same because you can always resolve in the first one, which is not working, and you have to go to the second one. But if you have SIP keep alive, it actually is faster for you to work out the other one is not responding versus SRV record. You have to flood the system and work out which one's not working. Okay, so this is our recommended method. When you send a call out, when you configure it, you can either configure with a fully qualified domain name on this side, or you can use the IP address. Remember, it doesn't really matter anymore since we're using the top-level domain appending to the @URI. It doesn't matter we put IP address or whatever, the call sending out always going to be using @cisco.com instead of the IP address. Okay, so that's 10.0 and 9.1.2's solution will resolve this problem for you. So when you go from VCS back to CUCM, you also have two options. Option one is using DNS to do lookup to find out which subscriber to send it back to, or you can use a neighboring zone to do that. So essentially the concept is the same. You can give them equal weighting, so therefore you can send all three out, or you can give the priority that will try the first one, the second one, the third one. I want to spend a little bit more time on this particular topic because during 2 weeks ago in San Jose, when I designed the lab with everyone, I worked out actually this concept still not very clear, and especially in the flat dial plan, it becomes quite interesting. So let me restate what we try to achieve here. We already, in the voice world, always you have E164 extension, right? And that's known, and that's, everyone accept that. On the URI side, in the SIP world, you always dial by the URI, which is sort of known and everyone accept that. The question is, how can we make sure that it doesn't matter which method you dial, and you can reach the other person in a scalable and consistent way? So remember, it's scalable as well as consistent. The reason E164 is scalable because there's a tree routing mechanism in there. So if you start from 1408, you know that 1408 goes to a certain trunk. But if you have a flat domain name, it's just name. It's a string at domain name. So you have to do a search through all the record of every single URI before you can reach a result. And to make things a little bit worse is that since VCS and CUCM don't share the common database, we have to have a default route somehow. That means in CUCM, I try to find Bill, and he's not there. So we will assume it could be in VCS. So we send a call to VCS. So what's the possibility? I mean, VCS Bill could be living on VCS. Perfect, found. What if I can't find Bill? What VCS then will do, I can't find anything, it must be on the CUCM side, or rather call back, right? So there will be a call loop. And if you configure it, actually it could always happen, but we do have an internal mechanism to sort of stop the loop eventually. It's almost inevitable that kind of thing could happen if you have a completely flat dial plan and you don't populate the database very well. So both are relevant. Of course, if you dial PSTN, E164 mobile, you have to use E164. There's nothing you can do about it. If you call to B2B using a domain name lookup, you have to use URI because E164 wouldn't do a domain lookup at all. And no one in the world has really deployed enum solution anywhere. And I think during the early 2000s, it was a very popular solution, and now it's not anymore. So of course, in the future, what we try to do is all these collaboration service, IM, voice, social, etc., all of them can be routed in both ways. That's what our inspiration is. So first we need to define a little bit in terms of what they are. E164 number obviously is just a set of number without any domain at all. Okay? But you also could have E164 number with add domain on it. So the reason for that is if you're calling a SIP trunk, so today I think Telstra and a lot of people, Optus provides SIP trunk today. If you have SIP trunk, of course it can be SIP, so it has to be URI. But really the soft switch at the back end is handling everything based on E164. So therefore you have this strange format, really it's the E164 at the domain, but your routing really is based on E164 only. Not the actual at domain address. Okay, so this is supported both for H223 and SIP. The last one is the proper URI. That means the username and at domain address. That will be the proper URI you should be familiar with. So this is the original way of interworking between them. And later on, I will show you what's the new way of doing it. Before that, for E164, it's pretty obvious. What we try to do is have a totally independent numbering range. So here is 8 whatever and 6 to 8, and that's 1 to 5. Obviously, these two don't overlap, and obviously, when you route, there wouldn't be any call loops, because we'll say only 6 to 8 routes that way, only 1 to 5 routes this way. It's no issue at all, right? And of course, in the VCS, we'll use a regular expression. On the CUCM, we'll use a route plan. So that's pretty obvious, and anyone touched this box before will know. So that's do a domain name lookup. We'll route it using the route pattern, and we'll do the DNS lookup, and then we'll append this. Remember, that's the top level domain name I mentioned to you before. So it's no longer the IP address or fully qualified domain name of the CUCM. We'll just do this plus at cisco.com. It will send that way. On the VCS side, we can strip this off, and then we find out where the actual endpoint is with the E164 number. Or dial back, it will be the same thing. It will have SIP trunk or neighboring zone pointing towards CUCM. And when the endpoint here dial this number, obviously, anything between 1 to 5, remember that's the 5th digit here, anything 1 to 5 will route that way. And it will do a local lookup. It's not found. It will do a route to the CUCM neighboring zone. And when the call arrives CUCM, of course, it will find this particular extension and terminate the call, right? So this is what we do in the new world. So take a little bit of time on this. In the new world, we try to do more of the SIP pattern, SIP route pattern match. The SIP route pattern actually has been around since about 7, but most of people never really used it. What it does is to route based on the right-hand side. So if you look at URI, there's the left-hand side at domain.com, right? So we call this the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the at. We always had this right-hand side sort of routing capability ever since 7, but since we haven't been really have those top-level domain name, etc., it's not really a SIP sort of very nice SIP solution interworking with VCS. We really never really recommend to design that way. But at the moment, when the 9. Release 10, we can actually route based on top-level domain name. So therefore, so here's the interesting layout we have. So on the far right-hand side, we have the VCS, most likely only be used by the H223 endpoint, the older template endpoint. Then we have CUCM, say running 9.1.2 or 10. And we have the connection to the internet side. So that means you can do the business lookup using the domain name of a route via the sort of DNS SIP trunk, okay? So we have the E and C. So the idea is this. If anyone on the CUCM dials an internal pattern, that means at cisco.com, if it cannot be found on the cluster, we'll send to the VCS. We'll say, oh, okay, it's not on CUCM, therefore it must be on the VCS. Okay? If it's everything else, that means it doesn't belong to your own company, we put in a default route for SIP. And then we send everything to the internet. Okay? That's pretty straightforward, right? And then on the VCS side, we'll say, find everything locally. If we can't find it, we route to CUCM. If this is really external domain name, if someone explicitly dial at, say, externalcompany.com, we'll go straight to the VCSE. And actually, the VCS C1 and C2 could be the same box. Just logically, they're two boxes, but really, it's the same box. So that's essentially what we try to do, right, between them. So remember I mentioned to you before there are three sort of headlines on E164 number, E164 number at domain.com, and the third one is full URI. So examine all three different options how we're going to do this. The first one is the number only. Okay. So when you dial number only, we will search through, so on the CUCM side, okay, we'll search through the route pattern and send to a nailed SIP trunk if we call vcs.cisco.com. Or if we don't do anything, we'll send to this address with a 10.10.10, or the address of this destination because we have a nailed trunk. Or we can do the third option, which is the top-level domain name, the new address, not new sort of domain name we define. So if you don't define anything specific here on SIP trunk, you have to run that way. If you click the option in the SIP trunk saying use top-level domain name, it will always go through third option. Okay? So if it matches this dial pattern, it will send a call out using this URI. Okay? If you don't click that option, sending the top-level domain name, it can be either this one or this one, depends on how you define the SIP trunk. Okay? So this is how you route the number, not the number with URI. The second option could be the user on the CUCM side dial a bunch of digits and then explicitly dialed at cisco.com. Okay? If the user did that, then of course it really wouldn't match any of the rest. It will go to the third one straight away and then just route it that way. Okay? But internally, if you look at search mechanism, I'll have a table later on to explain the detail on how it goes through the searching mechanism. It will always match based on the number. Okay, so it will match on the number, and then in the end, it will look at the right-hand side. It's going to say, okay, well, it's use the top level then. We'll use the same chunk to go out. Okay, so this example compared to the previous one, the previous user dialed the digits only. This user dialed the digits at cisco.com. Okay, routing actually is a little bit different. So what if the user, instead of dial at cisco.com, they dialed external company, let's say another company, domain.com's URI. In this case, instead of matching the default to VCS, what happens, it will match the default, the default route, okay, to everything else. So we'll get routed to the external B2B VCS, and then we'll send out to the internet. Okay? So that will be how the CUCM will handle this SIP routing, because it doesn't match the internal company's top-level domain. So therefore, we'll send to another company because it doesn't belong to our company. The third one will be the user on CUCM explicitly dialed a URI with name at domain address. In that case, we use ILS to look through the database first. Has everyone configured the CUCM with the ILS turned on before? So ILS is a database of all the URIs. Okay, you can manually insert URIs into the database. But what happens is it will learn from all the configured endpoint and populate the database between different subscribers. So all the subscribers will have the complete list of all the URIs on this cluster. So any of the subscriber here, someone call someone belongs to this, it will do a flood search by the IRS database. It will say, does this belongs to our cluster? If one of the subscriber comes like, yep, it's in my cluster, and it will get routed to that particular subscriber. If it says I can't find it there, it says, well, okay, so things are still within our company, it must be on the VCS side. So therefore, it routes to the VCS. Okay? Again, it will use the top domain level address as the URI. This table actually is very helpful if you ever start to configure what I just described. It will never really work the way you think it could work until you get hands-on and really start to configure most of the things and then try to think, why all of a sudden the return message has an IP address on it? Why it doesn't have a top-level domain name? It's very interesting debugging session. I think tomorrow maybe you can join the tech session and work out why it works a certain way. But this is a table. It's a very good table to show how internally CUCM decides the routing. Okay, let me start from the top. Natively, CUCM always work on extension, number, okay? So if you dial a number without anything else, it will do a lookup internally, same as you today, right? So same as 7.0, 8.0, it will always go through this lookup first, okay? If it cannot be found, it will go to the route pattern matching, and then depends on trunk configuration, send a call out. So option number 1, okay? If the user then dial number at domain, remember you have 2 ways, right? You either have its configured, route pattern configured, then we'll still go through the trunk. If it's not configured, we'll go through the domain routing. So remember this. The priority is always on the E164 extension dialing. So dial plan always takes the priority. If you have dial plan explicitly set for this number, it will always route to the trunk first, ignoring whatever is being put in at the letter at cisco.com. If it's not configured correctly, and then we'll do a SIP URI-based routing instead. For alias, we always do a SIP URI-based routing, essentially do the internal lookup IRS first. If it cannot be found, it will send to the external or VCS. And with at domain, of course, it's another company, then we send to the external. So this is the routing mechanism we have to use once go through. Yes?
All of these discussions that you're currently having apply to Expressway as well, or is it just for VCS?
For Expressway, you actually don't need any of this. So, right? So for Expressway, remember, it's just a way of doing the B2B. You'll probably only need 1 or 2 configurations, right? One is to do the DNS lookup and SIP trunk to go out for the B2B. The second one is to enable the Jabber and so on to go through the firewall. That's about it.
It's just for customers that already have this.
That's correct. Yeah, and then I want to achieve the sort of unified dial plan. Yes. So when we look at the unified dial plan, of course, originally we have all these endpoints, live on UCS and VCS and the CUCM and etc. We try to do now, of course, to move most of them to CUCM and then leave the VCS with only the minimum support. And eventually, once these guys get retired, we'll remove this VCS control altogether and probably keep the Expressway only. So that's coming to your question, that if you have a greenfield deployment, really you wouldn't have the middle section at all. And then all these concerns I just brought up, probably you don't really care. Okay, so the second part is the media resource. So what we have here is essentially we look at the 3 different type of resources. One is the gateway capability. One is the recording and streaming. One is the media transcoding capability. These 3, of course, we achieve with multiple boxes. For example, CTRS, we no longer really support. We really go for the TCS, and IPC VCR doesn't support anymore. So I really just want to show you that evolving a long way, that all these services itself still stays. We actually simplified the product quite a bit after this. Let me define the conferencing a little bit. We'll define conferencing as multiple endpoints joining the same meeting. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. It can be any type of endpoints. The interesting part, when I was talking to one of the CIO recently in Malaysia, was about how do you determine what type of endpoints can be on? For example, you can have a 9971, or if you've seen the the DX670, DX80, it's a phone as well as a video device, and as well as it's an Android device, right? So how do you define which kind of device it is to begin with? Okay, and then when the call comes in, it will then trigger the media resources. Then how do you define which media resources for which? Because some of media resources, for example, audio conferencing is quite cheap. Video conferencing is not, right? So how do you actually make a compromise and achieve both consistent user experience between them? So I'll show you a bit later on how we're going to do this. We really have different type of visual experience. That part, as a company, we have something called ActivePresence. You've probably seen it before. I mean, it's the big screen, have a film strip underneath. As a company, we're really moving towards ActivePresence. We actually spend less and less money on the MCU. That means a traditional MCU with a lot of funky layouts. We try to remove that, and we no longer really invest a lot of money in that. We're really moving towards the TelePresence server. That means a ActivePresence type of layout. Okay, and then in terms of different conference types, I'll show you a bit later on. So this is a typical continuous presence. I don't think anyone want to see this again. Brady Bunch, Hollywood Square. Actually, that market has changed quite a bit as well. When we just started, you pretty much see equal size only, and you see the then active speaker having a bigger stand and a smaller ones sort of getting around it, and you have active one in the middle and smaller ones around it. The problem really there is if you ever used the Rad Visions, earlier edition of the Rad Visions, or you actually use the Polycons version, or even the Codian version MCU, you'll see that people are getting smaller and smaller, right? So once they're too small, you absolutely have no maintenance. How do you maintain eye contact? How do you maintain the sort of in-person experience? You pretty much lose all the TelePresence promise we started around 2006. So there's no point of really, continue on this route. And as a company, we decided to go for the ActivePresence as our main strategy for conferencing moving forward. Something on the ActivePresence, if you haven't seen it before, you have the larger screen, which is to preserve the in-person experience. That means live size. This is sort of CTS 3000. For the TX 9000, it will be the same. And then you have little screens there. It can be individual single screens. That means each of them are independent. Or they can be a multi-screen, so triple screen system. They will stick together. All three of them will move around as if they're grouped together. And up to 9 of these little screens can be put on a single screen. So altogether, there will be 27 of them underneath. What we have seen, of course, some customers are asking, can we have more than 27? The reality is it will be so small. Again, going back to the continuous presence world, if human being is too small, what's the point of seeing them, right? I mean, it's this video lost its promise because he can't see the person's expression at all. So there's no point of having it at all. So one of the key things, I think the Codian guys really started this, was how do we do a universal encoding and decoding? The idea there is quite interesting. If we have different devices join the conference with different capabilities, let's say one of them can do 1080p, the other one can only do 720p, the other one only can do 480p. How do we maximize the quality to each of them? Okay, that means if someone can do 1080p, obviously they want to receive a 1080p stream. And not a 480p stream, right? And the 480 stream obviously cannot accept a 1080p, otherwise it will be a 1080p box. And the second part is the bandwidth. A lot of time, for example, in Singapore, I have tons of bandwidth at home, but in Australia, I think most of you probably only have 1 meg, 2 meg uplink speed at the best. I have 100 meg in Singapore. So if that's the case, obviously, if you are joining the meeting, you don't want everyone else's quality to get dragged down to the level of your worst possible video is. So what the guys has done, essentially, for every single connection, will transcode it to its best possible quality. So that's what really the universal encoding is about. And all of our devices, including the virtual TelePresence server I'll show you later, supports this kind of transcoding technology. So that's, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, have you got any plans to start moving towards SVC?
Yes, actually we already support SVC today. So the question is about, are we moving towards SVC? So let me answer the question in multiple ways, and then you can add a question if I didn't answer correctly. SVC has always been a promise of two things. One is that how do you incrementally decode and encode a stream without impacting the quality of the base? I mean, if you have start with 480p and then you have incremental 720 and a 1080, and then you're supposed to have 3 streams and combine all 3 streams together to achieve sort of minimum bandwidth increase as well as the possibility of dropping higher resolution to preserve the quality. So that's one promise of the SVC. The second promise is that in case I have a software-based MCU, that's what video guys has done, right? I can send you, if you only need a little screen, I send you the lower sort of baseline, and then if you want a higher resolution, I send you all 3 streams. Okay. So apart from very few guys done it that way, no one else has done it that way, because that really requires the complete system overhaul to actually support this. And then no one's done that. What happened then is people like Microsoft came on board and said, okay, let's do SVC. So what they've done is what we call multicast SVC. So what it is instead of sending the incrementals, they say, I send you 3 streams. You can optionally accept any of the stream. You can either accept 720p or 480p or 1080p, whatever, right? You can accept 1. And you can optionally ask for 2, and then maybe I can do the software sort of MCU thing to switch this. And that's what Microsoft has done. What we've done then is, because Microsoft implementation of that particular flow is non-standard, okay? So what we've done is that we put a gateway. So that means if you put a VCS there, you can do the interworking between the Microsoft proprietary version of the multicast SVC to a standard-based SVC. All the 7.tc7 release code already support native SVC. That means you no longer need the VCS to strip off the headers and then just send 1 stream only to the endpoint. We actually can accept multiple streams coming in, and the endpoint will select 1. Okay, so that's a supported feature already. So the way we connect to Link today, for example, will be Link sending Microsoft version of the multicast SVC to the VCS. VCS convert this into a standard-based SVC, sent to the rest of the sort of standard-based system, and then any of the endpoint can take that today. So that's a supported solution. Multipoint SVC also supported. The way we do that is same as for the endpoint, which doesn't support SVC, is to strip off the rest of the streams. So let's say, for example, if Microsoft sends 3 streams, and we send codec negotiation to the MCU says, yeah, the maximum I can take is 720p, and then we'll send a request to Microsoft saying, send me the Microsoft version of 720p, and then we'll send to the MCU. So that works. Okay. 3 types of conference: ad hoc, rendezvous, and scheduled. So ad hoc conference and rendezvous conference today are supported on the Conductor. So the difference is ad hoc, you don't have any meetings like one-on-one call. You press a button, add a user, and you add a second user, third user, fourth user, etc. Right? And this is triggered by the CUCM. So you define this as a media resource group, and when you press the button, CUCM will make a call to the Conductor, ask for more resources. Rendezvous, we also call this a meet me, and also we call it personal CMR, collaboration meeting room, or VMR. In the industry, we call it virtual meeting room. And we also call this collaboration meeting room, so Cisco term is called CMR. And it's actually a me number. So I'll show you later how the TMS can automatically populate all this. A scheduled conference, obviously, scheduled conference. If you look at a lot of products, right, I don't want to confuse you with this. It's actually very simple. If you look at 5300 and 300, they are the same box. they're the same hardware. Software is different. You actually can buy a 5300. If you bought some like 5310 and 5320 before, you can actually ask for a free upgrade, free SKU, to upgrade from MCU version to a TelePresence server version. Equally, if you have a 8510, again, it's the same hardware as 8710. You can actually get a free upgrade SKU to upgrade from 85 to 87. Okay, so they're actually same boxes. And the last one is the virtual TelePresence server. I will share a little bit with you later on. All these chipsets are standardized now, so therefore you'll see newer blades going to come out soon for the MSC world. But these are actually common hardware chipset and the same box. And software field upgradable, you can move from MCU to TelePresence server very easily. So the conductor. So what we try to do is instead of the MCU is being directly managed by VCS or directly managed by the CUCM, we try to make it more virtual. The reason we try to make it virtual, obviously, for two reasons. One is you can have multiple MCUs, right? And then potentially you want to cascade, from say one geo to another geo to save the bandwidth because you only have one link instead of multiple links going through. The second one is really about the complexity of video. So what we define as pervasive video. If you think about the pervasive video, really is the video call can happen anywhere in the organization, anywhere. So the question then is, how do we configure such that the system, without knowing where the calls are, find the best possible MCU to bridge the calls? Okay. So therefore we did a conductor. So so it's a fairly complex problem. So let me describe to you a little bit. Let's say I have 3 MCUs, one in Australia, right, one in Asia, and one in US. Okay. And because of time zone difference, most of the time, for example, during the Asia daytime, and Asia one will be heavily used. But every now and then, there will be more users than the Asia MCU will have in terms of number of ports. We don't want to tell these people, oh, you cannot use it anymore, there's no more port left. We want them to move to US one because that's dark and no one's working there, right? Vice versa as well, okay? So we want to configure such that the system always pick the local one first as part of the location definition within the CUCM, and then can overflow to the next one if there's extra ports available outside your location, and we want to have a preference of that. So all these rules and how do you pick them, how do you fail over, is fairly complex if we don't have a sort of conductor type of central controller to coordinate this. So this is why we build a conductor, and then we made it essential. Now, for example, with a virtual TelePresence server, you cannot deploy without this because it's going to be in the remote control mode only. You cannot deploy the VTS without the conductor. So to me, if you want to really achieve a pervasive video, you have to have the conductor today. I'll show you later on how some of the sort of really nice features we enable on this as well. This is essentially how the conductor gets used. So I specifically put option here because this slide was actually before the CUCM was able to directly invoke the conductor, so therefore still had a VCS there. I'll put this optional today. If you want to do it that way, it's okay, but the preference is not to do that. Let's say you have a SIP call, and this particular SIP call wants to invoke the conductor, okay? This CUCM or the VCS was the same thing. It will do a HTTP request to the conductor. It's saying, by the way, do you have any ports left on all the MCUs you control? Okay? Conductor will send back saying, yes, I do have one of the MCU here, it's free. Conductor then talk to the MCU saying, well, do you have any ports available here? Can I create a conference ID temporarily on the MCU and report back to the endpoint that endpoint should be redirected here. Once that's done, we'll see a callback if it's ad hoc. Remember, ad hoc is a callback function. That means once I call you and then I press add to another person, both sides will get disconnected and the MCU or conductor will call back to both of us and then call the third party. Okay? So you have a callback, or in the meet me and the rendezvous case, you actually will call the meet me number, and then this meet me number will be dynamically created by the conductor, telling the MCU what it is, and the call gets routed onto the MCU. So everything is dynamic. Okay? So we don't really know which MCU we're going to end up with, but we know that it's going to be searching the first one first, and second one, and third one, and it will just overflow to the rest if once it's occupied fully. Okay? Okay, so in terms of what the conductor is available, there are 3 versions of the conductors. Okay? There's something called a trial version. It comes with a B6K for free. Okay? It can only handle 1 MCU. So why do we do that? Because in B6K, if you want to sell MCU a VTS, for example, in the next 10.0 release of the B6K, in the HD version of the server, we'll be able to pack the VTS as part of the virtual machine within the same HD server. So therefore, you'll be able to have the MCU as part of the B6K. Now, if you do that, you remember, a VTS doesn't work without a conductor, right? Obviously, you need a conductor to make it work. So therefore, we're giving away this trial version for free, and it can only handle 1 MCU. And here's the thing, it doesn't have the text support. Okay? Now, the second part is a clustered one. That means you have a redundant pair, okay? And that one is mainly used for CUPro ad hoc, the bridge resource, or whatever, I forgot the name of it. But it's really for, if you have a CUPro license, personal multipoint. I think that's the name for it. So what it is allows to have up to 4 bridged meeting for a CUPro user. Okay. So here's the interesting part. If you want to deploy that, obviously you need a tech-supported conductor, correct? Otherwise, your customer will be angry. So what happened is that we will provide you a free conductor, a clustered one, not the trial version, the clustered one for the personal multi-point solution. So therefore, if you order the CUPro, say 50, and you get 10 ports, remember, for free as an MCU port, and you can also request for a free pair of conductors. Okay? Remember, you order that. Right? Otherwise, they won't give it to you for free just by package the license, because it's optional to deploy it if you use the MCU, not the VTS. But in reality, you should ask for it because it's free and allows you to scale a lot better in the future. And the third one is that it allows you to count the number of ports much better. I think the next slide is the one explaining that. So on the left-hand side is without conductor, on the right-hand side with conductor. Have you all seen this slide before? Okay, then we'll skip that. Personal 4-way. So here's the tricky part. What we try to do, obviously, is to encourage more pervasive video deployment, right? So what we've done is provide 4 port, and there's a calculation. So if you order how many CUPro, then you will be able to get how many ports. This is not a definite number of ports. That means if your customer usage pattern is more than whatever the BU is providing in terms of licenses, you can actually send an email to the licensing team saying, here's how I configure it, here's the usage pattern, and my user is using more than this, and please send me more port license. It's possible to do. Okay, I just want you to remember this. And because it's the way that the conductor works, currently we almost have no way of reinforcing this in terms of how many licenses sitting on this side and how many licenses sitting on this side. So ideally, what our preference is you will be able to run a conductor and 2 different user pools of MCUs. Otherwise, it's very hard to count what are the pools used for the personal four-way calling, and what are the pool of resource used for scheduled ones. Because remember, all these you need to pay for the MCU ports, and all these you get it for free, the personal ones. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're not abusing the free ones comes with a cool pro, and then the only way to do it, you have to configure two-user pool, and then you have to sign the license agreement saying, hey, that's how I'm going to use it, and I'm not going to abuse this the licensing structure. Hope you understand that. There's no licensing reinforcement, but that's something that it's honorary system only. Okay. Has everyone know about this personalized personal four-way stuff? It's pretty obvious. The virtual ones, the big chassis one, and the 5300 or the 310 or 320. These are the hardware-based. So if you compare the price between them, you actually see it's pretty compatible. I would say if you don't have UCS already in the data center today, this option will be slightly cheaper. Okay, if you go for B7K or B6K, that means you are buying the UCS, then you are better off to putting, for example, the virtual machine within there. Okay. Currently, I believe we support two different type of sizing in the 2.2 release. In the 2.3 release, we'll increase one different sizing, is 8-port. That means, we try to shrink the sort of lower end of the market. That means you use less CPU, so you can put everything together in the 7K or 6K. So that's one deployment model. The other one is we try to make it bigger. So for the company which requires a lot of port, simultaneous meeting, we can cater for that as well. So you will see both of the VM sizing really going both extremes. That's the case. If you want a backplane connectivity between these ports, chassis is still the only way to do it. That means DSP will still have it's the only way to backplane connect all different DSPs together to achieve the maximum of 96 ports per meeting. Okay, the VTS today wouldn't be able to do whatever the 96 is today. So with this conductor and so on, the preferred architecture, then again, simplify a little bit again. So what we're saying is, no, you no longer need to have a VCS, put MCU under the VCS for ad hoc and rendezvous and so on. We can have the conductor managing all the MCUs registered with CUCM, okay, with a SIP trunk. And during the lab itself, the Go lab, we also showed that if you have a H23 endpoint, want to dial back into this bridge, it also works. Okay, so they essentially achieved really moving the resource from the VCS world to the CUCM world. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Prime Manager and then TMS. Still have 28 minutes. I want to highlight a few differences only. I think all of you sitting, yes?
Can you cascade the TelePresence service?
No. Not yet. It's definitely on the roadmap. 4.0, we should have cascade capability. I think towards maybe calendar year, so this around end of Q2 calendar year, we should have the conductor managing the cascade of the TelePresence server.
And the TelePresence server is not compatible with
It will be. It will be. So, not yet. Not yet. So currently, both the C310 and C320 are not compatible with WET, so as the VTS. So if you think about it, they're the same code base, right? The only thing compatible will be the MCU and then the 87, 85 blades. Yeah. So on the TMS itself, I just want to highlight some of the changes we made, the enhancement. I want to first show you the provision extension, which is a CMR functionality. And the second one, I think we do have, I will talk about it once we get there. This is the CMR. So with a collaboration meeting room or virtual meeting room. The idea there is, of course, it's a me number, but the user themselves can create. Okay, so the user can log onto the TMS and create its own sort of meeting name. They can create a bill, for example, Bill's party room. So that's where everyone's sort of dialing for the party. And then you can decide their own sort of layout, etc. All these deployments very, very fast. What happens is that once the TMS is deployed, it will just pull the LDAP and just pull all the data from the user and it populates user.cmr or user.anything as a URI, as well as a signed extension to it. And that's it. So you can run sort of 5,000 users in probably 10 seconds, or that will be deployed. Very, very easy to deploy. And the user experience is great. And from there, we actually have a mobile as well. So if you, for example, connect to the web page with your mobile web browser, and we have a mobile layout as well. And from here, you can copy the meeting detail or email it to the people you want to invite. And when they call in, and you can create a personal ping for that as well. And when the user joins, you have to have the ping. Okay, otherwise it won't work. And another thing is the SE, the extension to, especially for the WET. I guess you probably know the WET quite well already since the sort of second year we're talking about it. The WET itself has multiple components, right? So with a TMS, that's the only way to coordinate the coordination between what we populate on the WebEx side, what we populate on the MCU side, and the bridge, the audio bridge you have to dial in between the MCU and the TSP, and the ping you have to pass between them. That's the only way to make all these different components work together. But the end result is that you will be able to schedule the meeting once on the Outlook and then via the Exchange, and then you can auto launch, and you can meet anyone anywhere, of course, with the content sharing, etc. So this TMS SE is an essential piece when you come to the WET. The Prime collaboration. I want to show you a little bit. So who has sold any Prime collaboration stuff before? Someone, you have. Very good. It's a lot better than no one. So I think 2 weeks ago, I did a presentation in Japan, and no one has sold anything on the Prime. I think recently things changed quite a lot when it comes to the management of the collaboration solution. I showed you the bundling before. Bundling after, so it's a standard-based Prime collaboration versus advanced Prime collaboration. How do we bundle them? Essentially, there are three main pieces in the Prime collaboration. The first part is provisioning. So the provisioning itself, if you have used the B6K 9.0, it already comes for free. You can log out and deploy any user. The user itself can log out, add any devices, and the user can turn on, turn off the sort of assigned services and so on. A lot of the customer really found this very useful. The second part is assurance. Assurance is really to monitor the video endpoint, the bridge, etc., to see they're performing, and then what's the MOS score and all that, can collect the information from all these endpoints, and then provide some basic diagnostic information. The third part is analytics. So analytics is where using the charging components started coming. Okay? So what the use for the analytics is, what's the trend of the usage? Most of the IT will have to do, for example, a 12 years planning cycle to see how much more MCU they have to buy, how many endpoint they have to buy, or how much gateway they have to buy. So you really want to know the utilization of your assets today, and that becomes a very good planning tool as well as reporting to senior executives.
Would that go into the detail of the actual ports, so the NHD ports that we're seeing utilized?
We will be able to see how many ports are being used. Yes, it does.
So full, half, or quarter?
I don't know how detailed it will come into, for example, is a 1 HG, 1 SD, and so on. But we will at least know how many people are dialed in. I really need to check the details in terms of the report.
We have a session down on the Prime collaboration, so you can have a try.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. No, I think that's not the Yeah, so it's quite different. The purpose is very different. One is to monitor and report. It's after the facts. So it doesn't really intervene in terms of how many ports are left and how we're going to use the leftover ports and so on. So Prime doesn't do that. It just reports to you what's available. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yes. So I think I understand your question now. So I don't think it will do it in the very short term. The reason for that is, remember, we're still going through to put a scheduled and ad hoc and rendezvous onto the conductor. So ideally, conductor virtualize all the MCUs, right? So if I'm an MCU, I really wouldn't know, am I a scheduled one or ad hoc one or rendezvous one? And really the job is assigned by the conductor, okay? So even TMS today, if I got a remote control by the conductor, TMS wouldn't find out what this MCU is used for anymore, right? So only the conductor really knows what this MCU is used for. So again, I need to get back to you on this in terms of when we'll have that conductor reporting back to the prime saying, his total number. I believe we report the total number of ports now managed by the conductor, but in terms of what is used for what, in terms of high level and sort of break down the resources, I don't think we can do that yet. And again, ideally, we don't even support that, the scheduled one via the conductor yet. I think by the time we hit mid-year, we will know exactly what the prime will report based on the conductor's capability. Yep, absolutely. I agree with you. If you want to know what your MCUs are doing, obviously we want to know that how many ports are used for schedule and how many ports are used for ad hoc. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah. So let me repeat your question. I don't know whether everyone has heard. The question really is about the scheduled one versus the actual used one for that scheduled meeting. What is the gap, and how do we analyze this after that? Right? Oh, yeah. So I believe we can do that today with a TMS, but with a conductor and all that, we really need to have the conductor have the capability first, and then we'll reevaluate whether that immediate bridge the gap can be bridged with the immediate capability with the conductor or not. So to me, the holding point is the conductor is not the MCU, right? So the conductor needs to have the feature first. Okay. So here's the table in terms of what is included or not. The standard prime collaboration is free for anything 10. Release. So for 10 releases, all these comes for free. And for anything before 10, of course, these are not free. You have to pay for it. For advanced, if you pay for it, it works from 8. something all the way to 10. So the key difference are a few things. One is standard only does the single cluster. Advanced does multi-cluster. The standard can only do a 2-level rule-based access control, and this have multiple levels, and also has API integration. That means if you have a post sort of a more advanced workflow software to provision use and so on, for example, integration with the HR system, etc., you can do that with advanced, but not with the basic, because it doesn't have the northbound interface. And of course, audit log and so on. For assurance, the same thing, single cluster, video, audio faults, performance matrix, email notification. Here again, you have much deeper monitoring. You can drill down a lot deeper in terms of what the different sessions will do, etc. But the key difference really is here. There's no analytics at all offered in the basics, the packaging, and then we provide this in the advanced package. This is for the long-term, the technology uses, statistics, and so on, reporting, capacity planning, etc. Okay. So we essentially touched on core control. We touched upon the resources. Then we look at the Prime Manager and the TMS. We're going to talk about the collaboration edge a little bit. So the edge to us is really defined as 4 main functions: the B2B, the VPN-less connection from outside, that's either the phone or clients and so on, fixed mobile endpoints, the integration with the outside world, for example, the Jabber guest, right? And then finally the cloud service, which is in the future for WebEx integration, for example, is already available today, and in the future, the Cloud Fusion. When you have the cloud and on-premise collaboration working hand in hand, will be the box to do that. That will be the expressway to achieve this. So this is the overall definition of where the overall sort of collaboration edge functionality will be. Now, when you look at the product mapping, it becomes a little bit more complicated. So let me run through this one by one. If you're on Java, obviously you're going to use the expressway, right? That's pretty obvious. And they can do voice, video, search, etc., contact sharing, internet, private, both can work. If you have C series, SX, DX, all these can work with expressway as well. Okay, so same as Java, it will be able to handle the VPN-less connection back. Now, when it comes to the older type of IP phones, we have to use Cube or using the VPN solution. Older phones doesn't have the expressway support yet. Okay, obviously your question, when is going to have expressway support? I don't know. Okay, this is a solution we use today. We use Cube mostly. And if you have a VPN concentrator and then you want to do IPsec, these phones has native VPN clients on it. Yeah.
Is it on the roadmap for support? Or?
I cannot say yes or no. We're pushing very hard for these phones to have the capability. But the reality is there will be a next generation of this phone coming up soon, and then we may just abandon to put these guys onto this thing. But the next generation definitely will have the expressway support. Okay. For SIP trunk, it's a little bit more complicated again, because Cube, as you know, does the E164 digit manipulation dial plan very well, right? It can do almost everything. But then it doesn't do a URI very well at all. So for PSTN or SIP trunks, it's actually a very good box. And for video, definitely we want to use expressway. Now, what we are doing the testing at the moment is to make sure the expressway for very simple sort of SIP trunk functionality, we can use expressway as well. Another way is to run the expressway as a VM on one of the ISR router with one of the server card. What do you call this? VM Lite or something? Yeah, you can see, and to have this running on there. So that's another possibility. But since we've done so much work with IMS vendors out there to do the SIP trunk interworking with IMS, I don't really think we're going to go through the testing again with expressway until the point that we will have to cut through to make them into a single product. So the product management in San Jose definitely is targeting towards a single ISR with Cube as well as the server card running on ISR to sort of have these two capability on the same box to achieve that. So that's what they're proposing at the moment. Finally, if you want to connect to Link, so coming to your question, if you have Link SVC connection, you can use the Expressway 8.1 to the video SVC, Microsoft to us. Okay, so this chart wouldn't really change that much in the next 12 months. I think hopefully we'll simplify this in more than 12 months time. Yeah.
Where do you see WebEx in amongst that? Is it emerging technology between WebEx and Java?
Very good question. I try to address here, but although it's not the intention of this session, if you take a step back, what I talked to Rowan when he was visiting Singapore the last time, the idea there is very simple. We want to have all these different services accessible by you, by the user, without really to think about is as a WebEx, as a Jabber, as a video, as audio, it's IAM presence, or is it content sharing, do I need to do Dropbox integration, etc. We don't want any of this, right? We don't want the user to get confused. What we really want is give the user a single client on the mobile device, or mobile first, and then dynamically invoking these capabilities at the need-to-use basis. So if you think about that way, then all of a sudden all the problems start to melt away, because we as partner and Cisco supposed to hide the complexity away from the user. Okay, so to directly answer your question, WebEx is an asset for conferencing. So there's no other guys out there, for example, can do a training center, 5,000 sessions, 15,000 sessions. No one out there can have all the iPad and so on to work together. And no one out there has that many data centers around the world to achieve all that. And so that itself will stay, absolutely, right? The Jabber, the JCF itself being a very good engine for video and voice, and of course going to stay. But the new client may actually have both capability built into it, right? So we're treating everything as a stack. We don't really care where stack's going to come from, but we just put together as a usable sort of capability for everyone. So that's where we're going. I think it's a very fair argument, because nothing can replace the other thing. I mean, Jabber cannot replace WebEx, WebEx cannot replace Jabber. So there's no point really to replace one another. Okay, I think the confusion is cleared up, hopefully. So Expressway is for everything edge. There's no H23 registration, but you can still do the interworking. VCS really is for H23 registration, interworking, but in moving forward, we'll have less of the so-called true edge capability. This is free. This is not. That's all right. It's pretty straightforward. It is actually possible to deploy them together. So there's something called, so licensing counting is very interesting. So if you bought, say, 100 traversal license here, okay, and then you deployed, for example, a CUCM and 10, right, with Expressway, you can potentially have this part for free, and then this, you still have 100 license here, right? So you can add them together. And so that's one of the deployment model we have, is essentially they're not two separate boxes. They're the same box, but the license is independent. Okay? All right, skip that. Do I need to go through this? Just skip that. I'm running out of time. So protocol load. So I will quickly show you two IPVPN working. So if you have a B2B connection, there's two ways to do it. One's via IPVPN. Of course, you need to solve the voice video over the VRF problem. So essentially, for example, if you have a central border controller to solve that problem for you, and of course, you go from one VRF of the MPLS to another VRF of the MPLS. The second one is via the internet. Most of the large service providers will, of course, prefer the first way, and therefore you have a QoS connection. You can guarantee the voice and video quality. But for smaller companies out there just want to do a internet-to-internet call, maybe it would go through the internet SIP connection instead. Finally, I think in the next 7 minutes, I will quickly show you the endpoint. If you have already seen the endpoint outside, you will look fairly familiar. So if you remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I talked about as easy as voice, every pane of glass, and better than being there. So I will map all the product lines in the endpoint to that. So because all these endpoint is registered with CUCM now, so a lot of the CUCM's functionality you inherit from this by purely registering this with the CUCM. Of course, the mobility, extension mobility function, shared line, remote expert, ad hoc conferencing, all these will become part of the sort of CUCM feature, right? In terms of the SVC, I think I answered your question before. In terms of where we see the H265 and WebRTC is going versus the SVC on H264. So who's heard about WebRTC? Most people know about it. So I think Rowan's last night presentation with partnership with Google, one thing we try to sort out with Google is to put H264 as a protocol stack within the WebRTC. Currently it's running VP8, right? So the idea there is that if we can solve the problem to run dual stack codec on the extension with a WebRTC, we should be able to make a native call going from the web page to any of the standard-based endpoint. So that's our goal. Currently, we offer the 264 codec to the Mozilla Foundation already, so that can be used freely by everyone. So that code is already available. But really, the next generation is H265, but it will take a while to get there, as you probably know. It will probably take 2 to 5 years to even get most of the standard ready for the MCU as well as the endpoint to support this. Some of the latest release, these are the TC 7.1 features, active control. Means if you're on the MCU call, you're on the telepresence call, if you're multi-point call, you're able to control the remote side. That means you're able to find out who's in the multi-party call, and then you can control the actual conference. This is done via the IX protocol from the endpoint to the MCU. The CUCM redundancy. So before the 7.x release, TC7 release, we can only register to one of the subscribers. So in case one subscriber goes down, we don't have the failover. Now we have the failover. CUCM provisioning for all these. So now remember the provisioning part of the Prime Manager. Before it didn't support the TC7 or TC6 release of the endpoint. Now it supports that. All the TC7 release supports native SVC. That means when the Microsoft link calling these endpoint, you can, after the VCS remove the proprietary header inserted by Microsoft, we should be able to do a point-to-point call without any loss of the resolution between link and our endpoint. Finally, is the ICE, the SIP ICE support to do the NAT firewall traversal using the ICE standard. Oh, skip that. Intelligent proximity. If everyone's seen the intelligent proximity, you can pair your iPad client to the endpoint. Oh, okay, so let me describe this a little bit. We actually did a VCCS launch, the video champion launch about half a year ago. The feature